So Todd, it's about transformative companies. So you've discovered 8 traits. Why don't you walk us through these?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Now we group these into 3 categories. What we call the unconventional, the structural, and the aspirational. And they break down like this. There is what we call fearlessness. And that's this notion that we often think of entrepreneurs as very, very risky. But in fact, what we discovered is they're not. They're very risk averse. Then what we have, what we call this notion of irreverence. And we sometimes think that's funny. But that's not what we're talking about in this case. What we're talking about here is this disdain, this natural disdain for industry norms, okay? And this ability not to measure what the industry measures by habit, but to measure more important things.
So Zappos letting people do a 4-hour phone call.
Exactly. Letting the call center operators not operate from a script and not be worried about a clock ticking. That's the important thing there. And the next thing that we talk about here is this notion of detachment, which sort of belies some of the Eastern aspects of these traits. Detachment is this notion that companies that we find that are transformative are what I call proactively inactive. In other words, they're very organized about the time they take off, detaching from the business, and sticking with that as an element of building their business.
And a routine. It's Bill Gates' Think Week.
It's Think Week, exactly. Jeff Bezos taking a week to pack boxes in a distribution center in Kentucky someplace. It's where people think. So the next category, again, in the structural area, the first is this notion of process. And this idea that you can create guardrails for people that enable them to be more effective and more creative in what they do.
So Chipotle was a great.
Right. So 15 ingredients, 65,000 choices. Okay. The next thing is what we call banishing small thinking. And really the notion here is how do you culturally get rid of the devil's advocate? The devil's advocate is something that is a healthy thing when it's used constructively, okay? But it is often used destructively. And the transformative companies firm that we deal with and that we study have a way to keep the devil's advocate out of the room, particularly in the early life of an opportunity.
Yeah, don't kill the baby.
Don't kill the baby. That's exactly right. The next thing we talk about is this notion of reinvention. And every company that we look at one point or another, whether it's from external forces or their own volition, had to find a way to reinvent themselves. And the way they did that was becoming completely obsessed with understanding their customers and building what I call customer advocates within their own organization. People, in some cases, who know more about a market than some of the other players in the industry themselves, and building off that notion of customer advocacy. And then finally, when we talk...
And you said they better have somebody accountable for advocacy.
Every one of these companies had an individual who's part of their job description to be the advocate for the customer.
And I love making sure that you, at the first 10 minutes of every meeting, talk about not your company, but what we're hearing from the market and the customer and those kind of things.
That has to set the context. So the last category, which I talked about, were these what we call aspirational traits. The first is this notion of universality, that a company has one central emotional fundamental need that they're going to try and supply and deliver to somebody. Facebook, it's connect. With LinkedIn, it's this notion of empowerment, that you control your destiny on the internet, your professional presentation on the internet. Ideally is our portfolio company, and they're a high-fashion daily deal site, and they are the in crowd, and they think of themselves as being the in crowd, and that's what they're worth. And all of their internal communications with their employees and externally how they communicate to the outside world is encapsulated in those ideas. And then finally, the last trait that we like to talk about is this notion of an appetite for destruction. And it's really this idea that you don't rock the boat sometimes, you have to sink the boat. And we went through an analysis of the media industry and how it's changed. And there are companies like American Idol that have completely turned the model for music, and popular music in particular, on its head. And did you know that...
And got rid of the gatekeepers.
They got rid of... Yeah, you got to tear down the gatekeepers. That's the fundamental thing. And 3% of all popular music now comes through the contestants, believe it or not, that have come up through the American Idol system. It is a phenomenal impact, and it's changed the industry.
258 #1 hits, you said.
That's right. In the last 10 years, on the Billboard 100 charts, they've had 258 #1 hits from their contestants. And that's just in America. And they are in 110 countries.
Todd.
My pleasure.